Welcome to Helion Talks. I'm your host, Tony, and today we're joined by Monique, Brouillet, Seefried, educator, archaeologist, former curator at Emory University and U.S. World War I Centennial Commission, and also importantly, the goddaughter of General Louis Dio. She is the co-author of the new book, General Louis Dio, the wartime epic of one of Free France's greatest soldiers, which bring to light the story of Free France's most brilliant, lesser-known commanders. Monique, a big welcome from us.
Thank you so much, Tony. I am delighted to be here and also very grateful to Helion and Company for having published this book in English, because there are so few books about the Free French and about General Leclerc and the French Second Armored Division, who played such a big role in the liberation of France in World War II, and of North Africa also, and Africa and North Africa.
Wonderful. And Monique, on that, could you tell us a little bit about, and I think you've just touched on it there, what drew you to this topic, and maybe a bit about yourself and your background too?
Yes. So as far as my background, I was born in Carthage, in Tunisia, and I grew up in Rome. So it's no surprise that at age 7, I declared to my parents that I would become an archaeologist. And I did follow my path with great concentration until I finished my PhD, which was on ancient glass and Phoenician trade and Punic trade along the Mediterranean and the African coast, even as far as the Crimea, selling little glass heads. Once I had finished my PhD, my husband and I had moved to Atlanta. And I would say that at Emory University, people were not especially interested just about the Punics or the Phoenicians. And so I was asked to start teaching in the art history department about Mediterranean archaeology and also Islamic art and architecture, because most of the countries where the Phoenicians were became later the land of Islam. But I also was for 20 years a curator at the Michael C. Carlos Museum at Emory University, and I was in charge of Near Eastern art. During that period, I realized that there was a lack of general knowledge of history in American students entering university. And so I felt that I should go back to education and to the education of young people, teenagers, if you want. That was my goal. But for reasons which I'm going to cut them very short. But the point was that with a PhD from the Sorbonne, summa cum laude, I did not have the credential to teach history in an American public school. I would have needed to spend several years learning how to teach, which is a total disregard of teaching as a passion and as a gift that you give back to young people. But therefore, very quickly, I oriented myself, or was in fact asked, to be involved with the International Baccalaureate, of which I eventually will become president of the Council of Foundation worldwide. So for 6 years, between 2003 and 2009, I was traveling around the world, visiting IB schools and speaking about education. At that time, I also went to Jerusalem on a trip organized by the Carlos Museum at Emory. And there I met a gentleman that was the son of a World War I veteran. And that is how I started getting involved into World War I, because he asked me to help him commemorate his father, who was wounded on a French battlefield. And so eventually we did a wonderful memorial, which is now near Chateau Thierry. This, as a result, when the World War I Centennial Commission was created in the US, I was asked to serve on the World War I Centennial Commission because I was someone who had accomplished something for Americans in World War I to remember them. and also because of my fluency in French, in German, in Italian. So in all of those languages that were really important during World War I. And so I served for 10 years with the World War I Centennial Commission, representing the US and organizing all the big ceremonies that took place mostly in France during 2017, 2018, and 2019 when we had the commemoration of the Treaty of Versailles. And it is at that time, and now I am jumping the gun because you wanted to know what triggered this collaboration with Jean-Paul Michel in writing this book about my godfather. I had read a book which is extraordinary. It's in French, but it's called The Nostalgia of Honor by a French journalist who is one of the top journalists with Le Figaro, and who wrote a book about his grandfather, General Crépin, who was the artilleryman of the 2nd Armored Division. And in it, he spoke several times about my godfather. And I wrote him a book congratulating him, because what he was explaining is how that generation of people raised the new generation to have a sense of honor. And that was really disappearing more and more. And so he wrote me back, we had lunch, and he told me that there was a French general who wanted to write a book about my godfather, General Dio. And I felt, here I am. I have spent now over 10 years of my life commemorating Americans who fought for France. And I have done nothing to commemorate the French. And you need to think that for me, as an archaeologist, there is something very deep in myself, which goes a long time ago, but I remember reading this sentence in the Egyptian Book of the Dead, is when you pronounce the name of the dead, you make them live again. And to me, that was really very much what drove me, or drove all the work I did for the World War I Centennial Commission. And in fact, made me accept to collaborate with General Michel when he wanted to commemorate my godfather. There are other details which are much more personal about having decided to help General Michel. And it is that my godfather did not have any children. For those who are going to read the book, which I hope will be many, he didn't have any children because he was wounded between his legs at the Battle of Kufra, and therefore could never have children. That was one reason. The other reason was related to my having served as a World War I Centennial Commissioner. There was a huge tragedy in the life of Louis Dio. When he was 5 years old, his father, who was a supply officer in one of the largest garrisons in France, the largest in Brittany, committed suicide on August 4, 1914, which is the day the Germans invaded France. He for sure had a nervous breakdown, having had to prepare all of those forces to make France, this region, ready to fight. But I could only imagine what it must have meant for a child of 5 to have a father committing suicide, and then for the rest of his school years and his study, when in France 1.3 million men had died on the battlefield, to be the son of an officer who killed himself and didn't fight. So Dio had a real desire to prove that he was able to serve his country. And I will mention to you something later about his will. He really did not want to be talked about. And General Michel and I really went completely against his will in writing his book. But in seeing the way the world has evolved, and especially in this vision of the nostalgia of honor that drew me to General Michel, I think that he would have appreciated that we wrote this book as an example of what people do when they choose the right path.
Monique, I mean, that was a tremendous explanation, right, that you've given us right there. Just absolutely amazing. And you've just given us and our listeners so many little bits over there that, the General Dio's injury, his past, which was traumatic, how it shaped his determination for the future. And then also in your life, your relationship with General Michel. And then also very personal that General Dio was actually your godfather.
Exactly.
Could you maybe speak to some of those parts, how that personal element was there, and then how it came with General Jean-Paul Michel, and then also your translator, Colonel Jason Musteen. There's just so many elements that had to come together for this book to find a life in English.
Exactly. So, my personal relationship with my godfather was really extremely remote because my father was a diplomat. I was always in foreign countries. My godfather, during all those years, until his retirement, spent most of his time, first just after he was in Tunisia when I was born. That's how my father asked him to be my godfather. But after that, he left for Cambodia for 2 years. And then he spent the past 2 decades following that, serving in Africa, was de Gaulle's closest advisor as far as the decolonization of Africa, the independence that African countries took. And he was extremely respected by the Africans. And therefore, most of those formerly French colonies asked him to help them rebuild their armies. So he was very little in France. And so I remember the last time I saw him was when I was 19 and I went to visit him at his office. And that was the time when he was in charge of the French armies abroad. And he could not come to my wedding because he wrote a letter to my father saying that his wife was not well. His wife has not been well for most of her life. It was really not a very happy marriage. And so he would always have to go back home because she was having some issues. So therefore, I did not know him. I didn't see him on a regular basis, but he was omnipresent in my life. The fact of having had a godfather who was a Maoist, a soldier on a camel, was something. All of my youth, I collected sort of images of camels. I would tell my mother, my father is not my father. I am the daughter of a man on a camel. I was sort of imagining those absurdity. But as a result, I really, as a teenager and as a young woman, I read so many books about the French army, about the Second World War, about the Algerian War, and my father was in charge of Algerian affairs when de Gaulle came back to power in 1958. And the admiration I had for the army really comes from having had this legendary godfather. And therefore, I felt I have helped commemorate Americans. Now I can help commemorate him, especially because he had no children. And his brother, who was 3 years older, had become a priest. And so he had absolutely no family who could represent him. Plus, and I had learned that, and I know you served in the army, but it's often difficult when one enters an academic world to get all the information one wants to have if one is a military person. There is, at least in the US, but also in France, the fact of being his goddaughter allowed me to have all the doors opening up. People agreeing to meet me. My father having been French ambassador to the Vatican, I could get very quickly his baptismal record and all of his grades. in the religious school where I studied. So the fact of being his goddaughter really helped General Michel tremendously in doing the research, especially because we were doing this research during COVID. So normally everything was closed. And being the person I am and someone who doesn't let go, I will keep asking for permission and getting people who knew someone to get the archives open. And for example, we were very fortunate because it was a time where all the archives about colonial Africa were not open to the public in France. And so I was fortunate enough to know someone who had gone to school with the head of the department at the archives, and he pulled all the documents and we could spend 3 days in his office. So I think our collaboration with General Michel was phenomenal because he was a career officer who had commanded the Régiment de Marche du Tchad, which is the regiment that my godfather commanded, and who had served in Africa, in Somalia, and also in Djibouti. He also served later in the former Yugoslavia, in the force.
The UN peace mission.
Yes, in the United Nations Protection Forces.
Yes.
And so he was in Sarajevo and so on.
What a career.
Yes, no, he had an amazing career, and therefore we got along. We were totally complementary. He was not an historian. I had the nitpicking habit of an archaeologist. Nothing that is written in the book does not have a published or source or comes from archives. There is absolutely nothing which is not documented, which explain why there are so many footnotes in that book. But I think I wanted to write a book that would serve historians for generations to come. And as far as Jason Musteen, because I don't want to leave him out because he did us a tremendous favor. I had met Jason Musteen after, as a commissioner at the World War I Centennial Commission, I invited a certain amount of students to come to the groundbreaking of the World War I Memorial in Washington. And Jason Musteen was professor at West Point that was sent with a group of students. So that's how we met and got along. And I realized he spoke perfect French. He was really a passionate historian about the time of Napoleon. He wrote something about Napoleon and Gibraltar. He's a member of the Institute of Napoleonic Studies and so on. And he is a retired Army cavalry officer. And so that was also very important because we will get back to it. But Leclerc was a cavalryman with all what it requires. And Dio was the mayorist, sort of working with a small group of people, and complementarity of those two men was incredible. Each of them brought what they had learned in military school and from their practice, as one as a cavalry officer, the other one as a mayorist, into the French 2nd Armored Division and made it the force it will become in the liberation of France in 1944. So Jason Musteen was also veteran of combat operation in Afghanistan, in Iraq, in the Horn of Africa, and also of crisis response in the Sudan. So he also had an experience with Africa. And when I asked if he would be interested, I had the incredible surprise not only to have him say yes, but to say that he wanted to do that graciously out of his love for France. So I was absolutely stunned. And for the 2 years he worked on the translation and I worked with him, it was an extraordinary exchange. I realized, for example, that for the beginning of the book, when Dio is in the Sahara, Jason Musteen will immerse himself in old songs that the nomads in Africa were singing, so that he would capture the feeling that was surrounding the soldiers and Dio at the time. So this book has been really a book of love and passion, not only from the authors, but from the translator.
What a powerful partnership. And, as a team, the three of you, it sounds really amazing. And coming back to your godfather now, General Dio, you mentioned this tremendous career he has, on camelback, doing all these feats of bravery. And not much is known when you, as you yourself have mentioned, Monique, compared to perhaps General Leclerc. Can you perhaps maybe mention a few reasons why that could be, at least from your point of view and your research?
From my point of view, I would say we cannot draw a comparison with Leclerc because Leclerc was even bigger. But if we draw a comparison with his companions, if you want, with Leclerc, like Général Massu, Général de Guibon, Général Étier de Bois-Lambert, who are all known figures, especially Massu, still in France, they all wrote books about their time with Leclerc. And they were people who were public figures but didn't shy away from publicity. On the contrary, Dio's humility was legendary. He always refused to put himself forward. He always liked to play the role of a great eminence, like he was the advisor of General de Gaulle for African matters. But he would not go and parade, if you want, in public about all of his accomplishments. And I think that I mentioned earlier, but I have in front of me his will, which is very short, in which he's asking that for his funeral, I don't want military honors, I don't want flowers, I don't want wreaths, nor speeches, nor flags of veterans. Priests who will be requisitioned should not pronounce one word outside of the ritual words. I don't want any commemorative plaque. We already are not having enough space. And then his last sentence explains everything. I essentially want to be buried like an anonymous soldier, which I have never ceased being throughout my life, in the deepest recess of my heart.
Yeah, wow, that's powerful.
It's very powerful. I think that he did what he had to do, but it was never to brag about it. It's quite fascinating because among his men, he enjoyed doing some bravado. There are examples of it. For example, before the Battle of Kufra, when they were in front of the fort El Tag, and Leclerc was really worried because the artillery was not coming. So Leclerc told Dio, go and get the artillery. And, in the desert, you don't go very quickly. And suddenly, Dio spotted the horse from the Italian general that was left in some part of a guard that was grazing. So he goes and catches the horse, jumps on the horse, and then parade in front of the fort where the Italians shoot like mad people. Around him, there is sort of fire everywhere, the sand blows in the air, and the horse obviously takes on an incredible gallop because he gets terribly scared. But as a result, Dio arrives very quickly to call the artillery. The artillery comes in reinforcement. He was doing those kind of foolish things and thought it was a lot of fun. But he would not go then and brag about it. That was part of his temperament.
A man after my own heart over there. And are there any kind of maybe stories, some of the battles that he was in, Monique, that you could walk us through? I'm sure our listeners will be keen, and I'm sure many of them will, if they haven't, would go and buy the book afterwards. But just maybe one or two other exploits from his battles, or some of the stories that still remain with you.
One of the stories is during the Battle of Normandy and the story of the Falaise pocket that the Germans were holding, and there was a real need to freeze away in direction of Paris. And so it was August 1944, and it was Dio tactical group liberated the city of Alençon. And shortly thereafter, they took the town of Carouge. There again, he did one of those absurd things that it was customary. He had hurt his ankle a few days earlier, so he was seated in his jeep going towards Carouge. And he had some machine guns in a few jeeps behind him. And here he arrived, and there is one German unit which is retreating. And he arrived, and then he started shooting his gun along the way, scaring all those poor Germans that go and disappear in the sidewalks. Then he arrives in Carouge, and he realizes he cannot hold the city, so he comes back. And then, the next afternoon, he returned, but this time having the Shermans of Capitaine Noël with him. But he was leading alone in his jeep with the Sherman behind him, and they went full speed. This time there was a German division. It was not anymore a unit that was retreating. There was a German division, an armored division, that was heading towards another town called C. And he launched his car full speed. The Sherman started firing everywhere. And as a result, the carnage was absolutely terrible. The machine guns were white. There were countless prisoners. And even in some account, some were crying, it seems, with fears. And bottom line, during that time, he was the one that succeeded to break that knot, which had been staying there for such a long time, but out of sheer courage and leading his men. And I think that is what his men were ready to follow him anywhere. Because of this energy he would sort of radiate and the courage he would demonstrate at all time.
Well, wonderful story. It's certainly a brave man. We're running out of time now, Monique. Firstly, a big thank you. But just before we close, are there any final thoughts that you want to leave with our listeners and with our future readers?
I think that what I would like our future readers to realize is the humanity and the courage of Dio. And also that in reading this book, they will not only read about the campaign in France and in Germany, they will have a fascinating discovery of what it meant to fight in the tropical forest of Gabon, to fight in the Sahara, and the condition. British have some sense of it because of the long-range desert group, but otherwise, very few people know what it means to fight in the desert and what type of men and women it takes to fight those kind of battles.
Amazing, Monique, and a fabulous tribute to your godfather, General Dio. We thank you. We thank all your team, General Jean-Paul Michel, and also Colonel Jason Musteen for this book. And Joe, from us at Helion Talks, a big thank you.
And I am the one thanking you.